Tonight, I will not be trying to tell you so much about basic information about Rudolf Steiner, except as it's comparable to Teilhard de Chardin. My purpose is really to bring Teilhard into the consciousness of anthroposophists. There are contrasts, of course, which I will mention. So it's not completely 50-50. It's much more that I'll be telling you about Teilhard and then reminding you of what you know that is relevant to Teilhard and Teilhard to Rudolf Steiner. So first, let's put the dates in your mind. Teilhard was, I always speak too quickly and make a mistake. Teilhard was born in 1881, so 20 years after Rudolf Steiner, and he lived 30 years after Rudolf Steiner. He lived from until 1955. In fact, he died on, I think it was, I'm not sure whether it was Fifth Avenue or Park Avenue. He was living on Park Avenue in New York City, where he had been for 5 years, basically forced out of Paris by his order. We can talk a little bit about that. He had he had deep struggles that were you could say that the Catholic Church, despite its fabulous resources, spiritual and material, intellectual, etc., doesn't seem to have a knack of landing on the right side of history. The best Catholic mind of the 20th century was forbidden to publish his spiritual theological works. So he didn't see anything in print while he was alive. He sent all of his single copies to his cousin, who fortunately then got them published. Rudolf Steiner suffered the Goetheanum and many other sources of pain. But Teilhard, as you will hear, I just think he's fabulously noble. Mm-hmm. You couldn't not admire and love him if you knew a lot about him. The biographies are so beautiful. His writing is so elegant, graceful, generous, enthusiastic. It's just, if you only had this one friend, you would be blessed. Okay, so you have the dates. They did not know anything about each other, even though their thought is very similar in many important ways, not the least of them being they were totally devoted to Christ, to the divine or eternal feminine, to matter, to evolution of consciousness, to thinking, to institutional life. Now, Teilhard's institution preceded him. So, he joined the Jesuits and the Catholic Church, who, was a priest, whereas Rudolf Steiner created everything from himself or out of himself and out of the spiritual world. So they're really different in that respect. But they both involve struggle. If you create something, you might not have promising or worthy followers. You might not be understood because what you're saying has not been said before. But also, if you have absolutely brilliant novel ideas, the people who run the institution you belong to might not like totally novel ideas, even if they're good ideas. This is observable. All right. So you have to be willing to endure the advantage of being sustained by a community. Then also the community can clip you and cut you and disappoint you. And he had plenty of that. So that's a little introduction to my enthusiasm. And I'm going to, those of you who read or even skimmed the essay that I sent out, I should tell you that I just skipped over the first part. It'll work its way in. And let's begin with the family. And I'm fascinated by the experience that both of these men had when they were about approximately 7 years old. You all know the experience of Rudolf Steiner in the station house, and his father's cousin appears. I just love when I think about that. What is the spiritual world like that this woman on the other side looks for help? And she doesn't go to her cousin, Rudolf Steiner's father, doesn't go to a priest or a minister or a professor or a psychiatrist or even a comforting friend. It goes to this boy, 7 years old, and asks him for help. It's a beautiful picture, surely, that he could be seen that way. He could be seen as a vast and wise, generous soul from the spiritual world. Now, Teilhard, at age 7, not in a station house with an underpaid father, but in a state in France, a beautiful estate of fabulous grounds, and the father was a naturalist, and there were, I think, 11 children, and Teilhard was in the middle. But he learned nature from the father, and he learned devotion to the Virgin Mary from his mother. So he has these two. You need two hands to talk about him, as you do talk about Rudolf Steiner. And so at age 7, he had the intense, what was for him, an intensely disappointing experience that an iron, I picture it as a bar, or it could have been a lump, but I think it was a bar, rusted. And he thought that this iron bar could be relied upon to last. He was looking, without having the words for it, he was looking for what would be permanent, maybe even eternal. And the bar rusted and disappointed him. And he said, that sent me, in retrospect, that sent me on a search for the eternal, for the immutable, for the unrustable. And he then went from one level of reality to another. And then he said, until finally I realized only the eternal, the actual divine eternal, could satisfy me. I had to know the eternal. I had to know Christ in matter. So even as a young seminarian, he was then at a Jesuit high school, and I assume you all know about Jesuits. And then he went into the novitiate at 18 to become a Jesuit priest. And there he studied science and theology, sort of, again, one hand and the other hand. He studied Paul and John in Greek, and he studied Plato and Aristotle in Greek, and he studied chemistry, biology, and especially paleontology. He studied the evolution of the earth. And so he was trying to find the spiritual in the earth, even as a very young age. I can quote something. I have more quotes than I can quote, but this one I think is worth doing. This is from the Steiner and Kindred Spirits, which includes maybe 10 pages about Teilhard, and at least 10, maybe 20, about Thomas Berry, who was a friend of mine and the foremost interpreter of Teilhard in America, and a very distinguished prophetic, ecological, theological thinker. He says, this is now on page 109 in the chapter called The Evolution of Consciousness, starting from the point at which a spark was first struck, a point that was built into me congenitally. The world gradually caught fire for me, burst into flame. How this happened all during my life and as a result of my whole life, until it formed a great luminous mass lit from within that surrounded me. The truth is that even at the peak of my spiritual trajectory, I was never to feel at home less immersed in an ocean of matter. Thus, between the ages of 10 and 30, at the heart of my absorbing interests and of my secret delights lay a continued and increased contact with the cosmic in the solid state. And he has a truly fabulous hymn to matter. And I can't read the whole thing, but just give you a little bit. This is written in 1919, and I'll tell you what in a minute what he was doing from 1914 to 1917. A hymn to matter, 1919. Blessed be you, harsh matter, barren soil, stubborn rock. You who yield only to violence, you who force us to work if we would eat. Blessed be you, perilous matter, violent sea, untamable passion. You who, unless we fetter you, will devour us. Then he goes on from there. Blessed be you, universal matter, immeasurable time, boundless ether, triple abyss of stars and atoms. Blessed be you, impenetrable matter. Then it goes on. Blessed be mortal matter. Blessed be you, and bless you, matter, and you I acclaim. And then I'm going to skip ahead. I acclaim you as the universal power which brings together and unites, through which the multitudinous monads are bound together, and in which they all converge on the way of spirit. I acclaim you as the divine milieu, the divine environment, the divine atmosphere. If we are to reach you, matter, we must, having first established contact with the totality of all that lives and moves here below. You feel the echo of Paul there? Come little by little to feel that the individual shapes of all we have laid hold on are melting in our hands. And finally, we are at grips with the single essence of all consistencies and all unions. It goes on. So he's in love with matter, and he studied it. And so if you think about Rudolf Steiner, you have to think of him occasionally, and perhaps more than occasionally, in some leaky, drafty train going from city to city in the middle of the night, and they're giving a lecture or meetings, and then another lecture and another train, and etc. And you have to be just totally sympathetic. But also think about Teilhard for 3 years in the trench in the First World War, surrounded by bayonets, gas, and death. And he was a stretcher bearer for 3 years, during which he wrote lengthy, gorgeous letters, a whole book called Writings in Time of War from 1914 to 1917, that he then sent to his cousin, who was in charge of a girls' school. So, and he had the conviction surrounded. If you've ever seen film of the First War, I mean, it's just unbelievably horrific. All these, in the mud and the slime and the bayonets and everything. And he said, a new age is coming. There's it's a transformation coming. So one of the criticisms of Teilhard is that he didn't have a sufficient sense of evil. And even Thomas Barry, who loved Teilhard as much as anyone, says that he didn't see that what in anthroposophy is so emphasized, namely Lucifer and Ahriman. At the same time, I just read Kathleen Duffy's book, Teilhard's Struggles. He saw a lot that I think could count, certainly for ignorance, if not for selfishness and evil. And so it's complicated, but try to see him for 20, 30 years, digging in the desert, looking for bones, looking for hints of the past that would reveal the present and the future. It's really quite fabulous. All right, so he was a Jesuit all of his life. He had vows of obedience. So he had to go where he was sent. Chastity, which he maintained. Everybody agrees to that. He obeyed his vow of chastity, obedience, and poverty. So he didn't have his own money. He had to ask for money. And he lived, more than 20 years in China with Chinese scientists. And years ago, I thought that in fact, that was one of my reasons I wasn't interested in him, that he didn't pay any attention to the fabulous religious tradition in China. But Ursula King, a British professor of comparative religion, quite a wonderful, deep person, has written a book, Teilhard on Eastern religions. Totally convincing. He spent a lot of time learning, probably by a lot of it by conversation of Buddhism particularly, but also Taoism, Confucianism, etc. I mean, he's really hard to criticize. So we have a comparable life when we look at Rudolf Steiner, who I think, and there's so many different words to use for Steiner, but one of the ones that I would like to emphasize is he was a sacrificial being. He sacrificed his entire life for anthroposophy or anthroposophia, for Christ, to be in union with the Archangel Michael. So I think these are similar figures in that respect. They are both totally devoted to Christ, both as a Trinitarian being, but also as the being that permeates the earth and humanity. So they both learned this concept of I, the spiritual I, from John and Paul. Yes, they both. One of the contrasts is, of course, that Steiner did not join a Christian denomination, whereas Teilhard was not only in the Catholic Church as a loyal, obedient priest, but was a Jesuit, which is quite a strong bond, and very painful for him when he was criticized and sent out of Paris, away from his order and his friends, including Henri de Lubac, who you might know was very great French theologian. Okay, so I told you a little bit about the First World War. I urge it on you. During those years, Rudolf Steiner was not oblivious to the war. He was passionately studying the war to figure out how did this happen and how can it be prevented. And if you don't know, there are more and more books talking about what he tried to do and how difficult it was and how he almost got a hearing, etc. It's tremendously tragic. And then during those last years, from 17 to 25, there was this an outpouring or sort of an explosion, but almost a desperate service and answering as though his clock is running. He's trying to, no, we need to save the soil. No, we need to save the children. No, we need to figure out the medicine. No, we need to figure out the rituals. No, we need to figure out banking. Just out this, all those practical works. Now, Teilhard didn't have those practical works. But his influence, which began to grow starting in 1960, when his books, 57 in French, were then published, he had a very profound impact on Vatican Council, because the leading figures of the Vatican Council were all Jesuits, and they all had drunk very, very deeply of Teilhard. So these are comparisons that are not oppositional at all. But here's a contrast, and that's very important when you think about Rudolf Steiner, was his esoteric stream. So I want to take a minute to talk about esoteric in contrast, I suppose I have to say contrast, to the mystical. So this Rudolf Steiner is on the knowledge track. Okay. I mean, when he experiences Christ, he says he stood in a festival of knowledge. It wasn't a festival of unity or devotion. It was a festival of knowledge. And again, he says that his task is to convince anybody who will listen to him or read him that we have to think differently. We have to think freely. We can't just think on sort of automatic, like we're driving on a parkway late at night and we just, ideas are coming like light bulbs and like this. And he says, no, you have to stop. You have to make freedom thinking has to be freedom. Now, Teilhard, well, I should add to that Steiner is in that astonishing philosophical explosion of genius, Goethe on one side, and then not opposite but complementary, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. And it's just a fabulous trio of epistemological genius about the right kind of thinking that will lead you to the absolute, to change, to history, to vast systems that come from thinking. And I'm just reading something Rudolf Steiner was talking about the three of them as initiates, and in the Western, he's talking about in Mark. He's talking about that they have something like the spirit, the universality of the Upanishads. Very, very good insight. But Rudolf Steiner is both in that philosophical stream, but also in this theosophical. All right, and then we all know about the complications, especially with early descent and libido and etc., which may be regrettable, and maybe that it actually freed him, etc. So I'd like to suggest that the mystical, which is, I think, the right word for Teilhard, tends toward unity. That is to say, it dissolves the separation between self and world, self and Christ, self and self, so that there's an overcoming of the dualism or the pluralism, the fragmentation that Rudolf Steiner was devoted to solving. But he was trying to solve it primarily in thinking. And Teilhard's number one word in his primary book, The Human Phenomenon, there is a translation called The Phenomenon of Man, and it's not a good translation. You want the later one called The Human Phenomenon. And he says, I am trying to help the reader to see. Steiner would say, I'm trying to help the reader to think freely. But what Teilhard means by see is to see in. It's like Owen Barfield, see past the dashboard, see inside. So it's a mystical seeing, but it's not. You could say it's sort of French and not German. It has a romantic, affective quality. Not that the German is not romantic; it absolutely is, but the language is different. There is an augmentation requirement. Okay, so then they each are completely devoted to the evolution of consciousness, and they don't say anything about what is or what happens or what will happen that isn't thoroughly evolutionary, which is part of what the Catholic Church had trouble with, and the Jesuit order to some extent, maybe because of the Vatican. But in any case, they had trouble with his being convinced that absolutely everything evolves, which is exactly what Rudolf Steiner was saying, approximately at the same time. Okay. And they also have these four levels, and Sri Aurobindo also has the same four levels: the physical, the vital, or the biological, the biosphere, and then the mental or Teilhard calls the noosphere, and then the spiritual dimension, which Teilhard calls the Christic and the omega point. This is where we're heading. So there's that wonderful similarity. They both have a very deep devotion and quite a complex devotion to the eternal feminine. And in Steiner, it's Sophia, Isis, and then Mary, and then the medieval Philosophia, and then the Anthroposophia, which is the being that is serving the cause of anthroposophy worldwide. Okay, then some of you have the essay. If you don't, you will. I think we can understand, well, it's obvious we can understand Rudolf Steiner in terms of thinking, feeling, and willing, but I believe you can find the same three spiritual components of the Teilhard's spiritual life as thinking, namely seeing or seeing inside, seeing spiritually, mystically, and feeling his. Teilhard writes so beautifully about love. It's just every time you're right in the thick of he's talking about ancient bones or something, and he's talking about love. It's really quite thrilling. And then action. Well, this is a man who was in the trench, who went to China and dug in the sand with his little knife. He was a man of intense, devoted action, as was Rudolf Steiner. I once listened to Stuart Easton talk about Rudolf Steiner's 1924. It brought tears to the eyes. He had to see this at another meeting, at another lecture, at another meeting, at another lecture, another train ride, another explanation, another attempt to solve the conflict between one generation and the next. Just endless, and people scratching at him. Dr. Steiner, if only you would tell us. So then the last part of what I'd like you to think about is the relevance of these two figures for the present ecological devastation, which is not likely to be abated anytime soon. And what do they bring? They both bring a spiritual dimension to Earth, and a more than an invitation and urging that if we are going to save the Earth, it will have to be in union, in devoted union with the creator of the Earth, the guide, the spiritualizer of the Earth, and the intent of that being to absorb the Earth into what Teilhard calls the Christic. He does not have Jupiter as Rudolf Steiner does, and I haven't broken that to my Teilhard friends. They like to hear some parts about Steiner, and then all of a sudden it's a little like a trap door drops. It says, too far. You can have that one. I'm not going there.
Yeah, my experience with Teilhard dates back probably 30 or 40 years, so I'm a little rusty. But I was wondering if you could say something more about the omega point, and particularly his the way he speaks of it as having to, it's like you say, it's Christ-centered, and that it seems to have something to do with being part of the body of Christ. And it also seems to have a social element. And there's something similar in Rudolf Steiner also, I feel, with this somehow, needing to wake on each other, and that we somehow have to move into this social dimension. Maybe it's a Whitson kind of situation in order to realize where we're going. And I just wonder if you could say anything about that in Teilhard.
I'd love to. I completely agree with what you said about Rudolf Steiner's idea of love is multi-level, the multi-dimensional, and involves the cosmos, it involves the earth, it involves the human, it involves animals and plants, and there isn't anything left out. and all of the parts are evolving toward a union, which he says is love. And I think Teilhard could say that exact sentence and say that it is all evolving toward a unity, which is love. And the omega point will include the Christ's transformation of the earth. It's the difference is that it seems like it's a single line that ends with human and earth absorbed into Christ. But as you know, with Steiner, when you get to the end of the post-Atlantean epoch, you then start over it, not over again as in repetitive, you start over again in the next phase. And he doesn't seem to have an eye for that. Yes, I would say that is a central idea. It's an anthropos, which is cosmic, and it seems to me, I'm not so clear about the extent to which the human is the purpose.
Yeah, that's kind of
that's the big argument. Is the human the purpose? I don't know how it can be the purpose, considering that the purpose is the fulfillment of Christ's creative design. But the human is the purpose because the human is uniquely able to advance Christ's cause. So it's the purpose if you include the purpose inside of Christ, but not as in like a humanistic view that the human would be the purpose in its own right. Spiritual hierarchies, he works with Christ, Sophia, and I guess that's all. Nothing about the Archangel Michael, nothing about, certainly not any of the esoteric figures. No, it's Christocentric almost exclusively. And he has these beautiful passages on the divine feminine, but there's hardly any awareness in the writing, at least, of how that's related to Christ. So the entire body of writing is non-systematic. It's poetic, it's mystical, it's it kind of bursts forth, but not in a way that, it's not Thomas Aquinas, there's this question, this answer, this question. No, it's hard to get the answers. I'm not, I've been spending a lot of time with them, and I'm not sure, that I have it all. And I'm not sure it lends itself that way. So no other hierarchy. And since, I guess you could say, since Thomas Aquinas, there haven't been Christians writing with the full hierarchy that I'm thinking of. Thinking of de Lubac, no. Balthazar, no. Thomas Keating, no. It's really Christ and human and earth. I think pretty consistently.
No. Did he see himself as part of the Catholic mystical tradition then?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
He did. He knew that he was a Catholic mystic and a new variety because he was so devoted to earth. And a lot of the Catholic mystics were not.
Have you read Thomas Merton about Teilhard?
Merton did comment on Teilhard with admiration, but hardly any overlap, except that they were two good Catholic mystics, and they both had Sophia. There's a wonderful book by Christopher Pamuk on the hidden Sophia of Thomas Merton. Very beautiful book. Yeah, about the Hagia Sophia, which was a poem by Merton about Sophia. But again, there's no science in Merton.
Right.
Art is always scientific, not philosophical, but scientific.
Mhm.
You spoke quite a bit about Teilhard and evolution. I mean,
Yeah.
he has that sense of evolution. And more so than Steiner, he seems to have much more of a regard for, I would say, sort of a Darwinist bent, that things evolve, but they're very dependent on the states that have gone before. And I was just curious, in Teilhard, where does he speak about human freedom? I know there's a couple places where he speaks about choice, but is it as prominent in this whole idea of evolution, what the place of freedom is?
No, it's not that prominent. What's prominent is love, union, community, but he's not particularly concerned with freedom. And he's not particularly concerned with evil. And Steiner, those freedom and evil are locked in a great struggle. I mean, Ahriman is destroying human freedom, and that's evil.
You mentioned that he worked, that he was in the trenches in the First World War.
Yes.
And I just wondered if he had some kind of trauma in there at that time in his life, which affected him. It doesn't seem like it. It seemed like he lived a very harmonious life.
I completely agree. I once asked Mary Evelyn Tucker, who is a really great Teilhard scholar and a friend, I said, how do you understand those 3 years? Why wasn't he traumatized? Why didn't he have, post-traumatic disorder? Why wasn't he, he's writing these gorgeous essays about, spirit and matter and the Christic and the priest and the etc. And it does seem that his worldview was so large and so permeated with love that he was able to see that this too has a meaning, that it has, this is the cauldron, this is the fire of transformation. Yeah, I find it hard, but I believe, first of all,
Did he keep a diary at all?
I don't know that I would call it a diary, but he was constantly writing essays. Some of them very short, a couple pages, but some 30, 50 pages. How he could have written those years. Well, also when he was in China, living in this, scientific hut with 5 scientists and out digging in the desert all day, coming back and then writing about, the Christic. It's really quite astonishing. As well with Steiner too. He was on the train at night and he was lecturing in the morning, then another lecture in the afternoon and another lecture in the evening. I know these are very special beings, very, very special. And he had many, I shouldn't say many, but he had several women friends who clearly loved him. And one in particular was in love with him and very eager to have a life with him. And he just kept saying, it's not going to be. We can be friends, we can be affectionate, but don't ask for what you can't have. She was a sculptor and she did beautiful sculpture of him. And I think, there's, again, Ursula King has an essay on the women around Teilhard. I mean, he was a very lovable man, and he was very affectionate. He loved his mother, he loved his sister, he loved that cousin. He loved her for sure. And he has essays on the transformation of eros into love. The sublimation of sex in the service of a higher consciousness.